One of the most important parts of a VJ rig is mixing between sources. And if you're going to be using this for live performance, it's a really good idea to give it a nice UI and some handy features to make it easier to work with. Because trust me, you really do not want to be hunting around in a network editor in the middle of a performance. So in this video, we're going to make a reusable Crossfader component with a nice UI that you can use as a mixer for a VJ rig. I'll put a version of this up on Patreon for download with a couple of extra features, but going through the process is a chance to get yourself a little bit more comfortable with building out your own systems. And we're going to be doing this with kind of a developer mindset and following some practices that will work well for building reusable components that you can use in multiple different projects, including big, complicated ones. The first step in making a component is to figure out, what do you want it to actually do? So first, we want it to have two top inputs and one output. We want the ability to easily switch to either of those inputs or show a composite of the two. There should be a way to smoothly crossfade between those, and that smoothness should apply even if you have a jittery MIDI input or something controlling the crossfader. But we also want the ability to kind of jump immediately to one source or the other for drops or other kinds of cues. Before we do any of that, though, let's first set up some video sources that we can use for testing. So these could be any sort of top. If you're building out a VJ rig, you'll likely end up using some sort of scene switching sources. I made a few videos about approaches for that. They get into a lot more detail, but for now, we'll just keep it simple. Now, you could drag in video files if you have some around. That's the approach I'm going to use. Or you can create a movie file in and select the file from there. So if you're doing that, you could have two of those with different files. Make sure they kind of look distinctive enough that you can kind of tell the difference. If you have a camera or a capture card or something, you could create a video device in. Or if nothing else, you could create like a noise top and set an expression in the transform, maybe like adds time dot seconds times 0.2, just to give it some motion. Now we want to have all these inputs have the same resolution. So if you're using video clips, you'll want to either make sure that those are the same resolution, or we need to kind of like force it into the same resolution. So that could be with either a fit or a resolution top. So we could do fit, and then pick whatever resolution you want. If you're on non-commercial, you probably do 1280 by 720. But if you're on commercial, you can do 1080 or something better if you want. And for fit, you want to do fit outside to make sure that you don't have any bars on the top or the bottom. So we'll make two of those. If you're using noise or something like that, you would just set it on the resolution here. You can also do that on the movie file ends, but just to make it easier to switch between things, having a separate operator that does that scaling might be beneficial. Regardless of what you end up deciding to use, let's create a null top coming off of each of these. And we can name the first one source 1. And the second one source 2. Now we can start blocking out the crossfader component. So create another null coming off of source 1, and you can use the shortcut Alt-N to do that. And then we're going to do the same thing for source 2. Then select both of those new nulls, click in an open spot in the network, and do collapse selected. This will create a new base comp, and we'll move those nulls in, and it'll create the in tops needed to wire them up. Let's rename this to Crossfader. And then jump inside. And for whatever reason, it decided to put input 2 above input 1. So let's first go up a level. If yours are aligned correctly, you don't need to do this, but swap which one's wired to which. So source 1 is going to be this. And I like to keep these inputs kind of in vertical order. So let's move the input 2 below input 1. And then to make sure that the outlets show up in the right order, for this input 2, we're going to set the connect order to 1. And then you can jump up just to verify. Let's rename this first one to source 1. And second one to source 2. And then let's create a crosstalk. And wire up those two sources into it. And then drag out from there, create another null, or you could do Alt-N. Let's call this one mixed. And then drag out from that, and create an out top. Using this crosstalk, we can fade between the two inputs. So we're done, kind of. No, we're not. But it can crossfade, so that is at least something. Next, we'll set up the parameters that we want to expose on the component. So let's jump up a level, right-click on our comp, and do Customize Component. Now let's add a page called Crossfader. And change the type here to float, and add a parameter called Crossfade. Then for the range minimum, we're going to set that to -1. When this parameter is at -1, we're going to be showing the first input. And then if it's at +1, we're going to show the second input. And then if it's at 0, we're going to do that kind of composited version of the two. As we said earlier, we were going to be smoothing out those transitions. So let's add a parameter for how long those transitions should be. So we can call this one fade time. And set the default to maybe like 1, and then range max to 10 or so. For parameters that are amounts of time, I like to be very clear as to what unit those are in. So in the label here, let's just add parentheses and then sec, just to indicate that this means seconds. We're also going to add a menu parameter for the composite mode, but we're going to do that a little bit later. Next, we'll add some buttons to fade to particular values or jump to them immediately. So let's select the type pulse and type in fade to 1, and then do fade to mix, and then fade to 2. And then we're going to do jump versions of those. So jump to 1, jump to mix, and then jump to 2. To make things a little bit neater in the parameter dialog, let's group these into sections. So let's select the fade to 1 and jump to 1, and then switch on that section setting to put a little divider above them. And let's close the customize dialog and jump back inside. Now we'll build out the actual mixing portion of this. So we're going to be having 3 things that we want it to be able to show. So there's, input 1, input 2, and then that composited version of the 2 of them. Now the crosstalk only does 2 inputs, so we're going to need to replace that. So let's delete that and create a switch top and switch on that blend between inputs setting. Then let's create a composite top and wire up the 2 sources into it. Then let's give ourselves a little bit more room and Then wire up source 1 to the switch, and then this composite, and then source 2. And then connect that switch up to that mixed null. We mentioned earlier that we want a parameter for this composite operation, so let's right-click in the network and do Customize Parent Component. And then we're going to take this operation parameter off the composite, drag it into this list on the right. And then do Set Reference Expression on Source. If you're curious why we did that instead of a binding, check out my video about parameter modes. The reason that we drag this in rather than creating it first and then hooking it up using an expression is that doing it this way automatically links the menu options in that new parameter to the same ones that are shown in the composite top. So it adds this little menu source thing here, and then we always get the same menu options in there. And even if Derivative decides in some future release to add, some magic new blend mode, that's just going to automatically show up in there. It is worth noting, though, that if you rename or delete that composite top, this thing is still going to be trying to access it, so you might get some mysterious errors that show up on the component. Then we can close that dialog. Next, we'll attach the crossfade parameter of the parent component to the index on this switch here. But we aren't going to just directly reference it using an expression or a binding for a couple of reasons. So first, the component parameter goes from -1 to +1, and this switch wants 0 to 2. And then second, we want to smooth it out over time. So instead, let's do this with some chops. So let's create a parameter chop. And for the parameter here, use this little drop down and grab crossfade. So it's just going to get that one. Then let's add a math chop coming out of that. For the range, we can change this input range to -1 to 1, and then the output range to 0 to 2. Then let's add a filter chop coming out of that. And finally a null at the end. Let's rename this null to fade value. Then activate the viewer here using the little plus, go over to our switch, and then drag this channel onto index and choose chop reference. And then we can deactivate the viewer there. Then we can test it. So right click in an open spot in the network and do open parent parameters. And we can try changing our crossfade here. And let's give ourselves a little bit of view. So try changing the crossfade, and you'll see how it gives us either one or the other, or this multiplied version of the two. And all those changes are smoothed out over time. Then we want to get the timing correct. So on the filter, let's take the fade time and drag it onto filter width and do reference. Next, we'll set up the actions that go along with these pulse parameters that we gave ourselves. So let's create a parameter execute dat. We're going to use a little bit of Python here, but don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it. It's not going to be a lot. For the ops parameter here, just put in ... to point to the parent component. And then for the parameter names, let's do fade to, remembering to have just the first letter be capital and everything after that be lowercase, and then star, and then same thing for jump to star. We can switch off this value change toggle here since we're only going to be using the pulse callbacks. Right click this dot and do edit contents. This is going to pull up whatever text editor that you've set up in your preferences in TouchDesigner. I'm using Visual Studio Code, but Notepad should probably be fine as long as you're careful about your white space. Let's clear out everything above this on pulse, and then clear out everything after that first line there. And delete any extra lines. add a new line. If it isn't indented, press tab to indent it. This might either do a tab character or some spaces. It really doesn't matter as long as it's consistent within this file. Let's type in if par.name.ends with parentheses and then a quote and a 1 and then a parentheses and a quote if it didn't automatically fill those in, and then a colon and another line indented if it wasn't already, and do parent.par.crossfade equals -1. And then let's add another line, unindent this one level, so shift tab, and then do elif par.name.ends with, and then parentheses and quote, and mix, and then quote and parentheses, and then colon, another line, indent it 2 layers if it wasn't already. I'm going to do parent.par.crossfade equals 0. And then we're going to do another one, unindent one level, do elif par.name.ends with, and then parentheses and quote, and 2, and then quote and parentheses, and colon, and then finally indented 2 layers, your parent.par.crossfade equals 1. And then for the jump actions, let's add another line after that, unindent it back to the same level as those ifs, and then type in if par.name.starts with parentheses and quote, and then capital J jump, and then quote and parentheses, and then colon, and then another line, indented 1 layer, and do OP parentheses quote, and then filter 1, and then quote parentheses dot par dot reset pulse, all lowercase, and then dot pulse, and then parentheses and close parentheses, and save that. So then let's head back to touch, and we can increase the fade time just to make it a little bit more obvious that it's jumping or not jumping. And then try fade to 1. If you are getting some weird errors in here, like this tab error, inconsistent use of tabs and spaces and indentation, this means that your text editor is screwed up. So let's head back over there. In Visual Studio Code, we did actually see that it was showing these little squiggly error markers, but shouldn't have ignored those. So the stuff that got filled in by default might have been space characters. And if that's the case, then you're going to want to delete those and tab. So that does a tab character instead. And then for these ones, you want to do the same thing. This is one of the reasons why it's really good to switch on visible white space in your editor. So I'll usually do in Visual Studio Code, Control-Shift-P, and then do toggle render white space, and it'll show these little markers here. Depending on which text editor you're using, this problem may not have come up for you, but if it did, this is typically how you fix it. So let's save that, head back over to touch, and then now we can try testing again. So let's do fade to 1, and we still have an issue. So I just encountered an issue where it didn't really pick up on the fact that I had fixed those. So I had to go over to the editor and just double check everything, save, a few times just to be sure, head back to touch, and then I just kind of toggled bypassing on this. For some reason, it then picked up the change. So now we can test fade to 2, and it'll jump over there, and then we'll see that slow transition. And then if we can do jump to 1, and it's an immediate cut. Hopefully this hasn't scared you off from using Python. It's not normally this bad, but sometimes editors get a little messed up. Let's head up a level in the network, and we can close this little parameter dialog. And let's add a null coming out of that just so we can see the results. You could also turn on the viewer in the crossfade. component. So this is basically it for the actual functional part of the Crossfader, and you can drop this into projects and use it as it is. But we did say that we wanted to have a UI for it. There are two ways that we can approach this kind of thing. One option is to change this into a container comp and then add all the UI stuff kind of right in there along with the functional parts. And that's fine. But if we're going to be using this in larger projects, it can be helpful to have things kind of separated out where you have the functional part and then you have a separate UI that connects to it and talks to that, but is in a separate component. And that allows you to move around portions of your UI in the project. You know, it might be layered a few levels of components down, and you don't have to rewire everything to accommodate for that. You just need to tell that component which crossfader it's supposed to care about, and it should handle the rest. You may hear developers use terms like model view controller, which is basically this concept of like separating out your UI from the functional parts. But, you know, more complicated because we developers love complicated stuff. Now let's make our UI. So let's create a container comp. And just stick that above. We can call this one Crossfader UI. Then we need to tell this UI component which crossfader it's supposed to care about. So this means that you could have multiple of these in your project. If you had multiple different mixers or something, each crossfader UI needs to be pointing at the right crossfader. And in general, it's good to not reach from inside one component to the inside of another component without being able to like switch which thing is pointed at easily. So on the Crossfader UI, let's right click that and do customize, add a page called UI, and then switch the type here to comp, and then we can do Crossfader comp and add one of those, and then we can close that. And let's switch over to that. Let's drag this comp onto that parameter. So now it's got a reference to that. So now anytime inside of this component, it can just look at its own Crossfader comp parameter, and that will give it a path to this component that it's going to be interacting with. Let's jump inside the UI. Our UI is going to have a few parts. So there's going to be previews of each source and then the final mixed output. Then there's going to be that main slider. And then there are going to be buttons to do that jumping or fading to specific values, as well as a button to get at the settings for fade time and composite mode and that kind of thing. I did a series of videos about UI, including stuff about layout and widgets recently, so I recommend checking those out if you want more detail about that. So we're not going to get into as much in this one about why layout works the way it does. We're just going to kind of do it in a way that can be stretched and resized well, but I'm not going to like explain every aspect of why that works. Let's create another container comp inside this one, and we can call this one root panel. Set the horizontal mode to fill. Same thing for vertical. Since we're going to be arranging this in rows, on the children page, let's set that to top to bottom. Then let's right-click in the network and do Open Parent Viewer. Next, we'll do the previews. So let's create another container comp and rename this to Preview Row. And then make it a child of the root panel by dragging that from this top connector onto the bottom of root panel. And for this one, we want to change the horizontal mode to fill as well. Same thing for vertical. And for children, this one we're going to do left to right. And let's do another container comp. We're going to be doing a bunch of these. We can call this one Source 1 Preview. Make this a child of Preview Row. And again, we're going to change this to fill and fill. And then for the look page, expand this background top parameter, switch it to expression mode using the little blue box here, clear out what's currently there, and then type in parent, parentheses, dot par, dot crossfader comp. So this is getting that parameter. Then we want to do eval, and then parentheses, close parentheses, and then dot, and then op, parentheses, quote, and then let's do source underscore 1, and then parentheses and quote. This is using that parameter to get a reference to the Crossfader comp that we're dealing with, and then we're grabbing this source 1 top out of that. Then let's make 2 copies of this container comp. On the first copy, we can rename this to mixed preview. And for the expression here at the end, replace source 1 with mixed. And then for the last container comp there, change this to source 2 preview. And then for the background top here at the end, we'll just replace that 1 with a 2. To make it a little bit more clear which one is which, let's jump up and open the parameters of this crossfader here. Just kind of stick these off to the side. And let's set the crossfade to 0. And then reduce the fade time to like 1 or something. So this gives us 3 very distinct things. And let's head back into the UI. And we want to get these showing up in the right order. So on the mix preview, you can change on the layout page the align order to 1. And then for source 2 preview layout, we want to do align order 2. It's currently stretching these in kind of a weird way. So let's select all 3 of these, go to this look page, and then instead of stretch for the top fill mode, let's change that to fill best. Then we want to kind of highlight the middle one more than the other 2, since that's going to be the output of our mixer. Let's select both of our source preview comps, and then on the layout page for the horizontal fill weight, let's drop that to around 0.5 or so. So we get a slightly bigger main preview in the middle, and then these 2 little ones on the side. And then I'm going to close the parameter dialog there. So next we'll do the slider, and we're going to do this with a widget. So open the touch palette, go to UI basic widgets, scroll down to slider horizontal X fade, drag one of those in, and then we can close the palette. Make this a child of root panel. And on the layout page, let's change the width to fill mode. And then for height, we're going to keep it on fixed, but let's change the height here to 50. And then to keep things in the right order, let's change the align order to 1 so that we just make sure it goes below the previews, even though it was by default anyway, but it's good to be explicit about that kind of thing. Then on the label page, let's switch off display. Same thing for field. And then on the slider page, let's turn off label display here as well, since we don't really need to label what this is. It's kind of obviously a crossfader. Let's rename this to Crossfade Slider. And then head over to the values page. We're going to expand this value 0. And then we're going to switch this into bind mode. So using the purple box on the right. Be sure to do that and not expression mode. Then let's go over to one of our preview comps and just copy this expression here for the background. Go back to the slider, and then in the value parameter here, the bind expression, paste that in. And then we can delete this bit at the end with the OP and then that operator name, and instead do .par.crossfade. So now when we fade that, we can see in the preview there that it is actually updating that component and it's fading to the right thing. Next, we'll set up the buttons for fading to specific values. So let's give ourselves a little bit of space there and then make a copy of preview row. Put it over here. And then let's rename this to fade button row. And then on the layout page, on the line order, set that to 2 to put it at the bottom. And then for vertical mode, let's change that to fixed height. And then drop that height down to around like 25 or so. Open the palette again. And under basic widgets, look for button momentary. Drag that in. And we can close the palette. Make this a child of that fade button row. And we can rename this to fade to 1 button. And on the layout page, let's change the vertical mode to fill. And then we're going to change fixed aspect to use verticals. This is going to make sure it's a square that's always of the whatever height that row is. Then on the label page, let's turn off display. And then on the button page, down at the bottom, for this fixed width horizontal mode, change that to fill. Then we're going to swap out a different icon here. We're going to replace what's currently there with CHR, parentheses, 0x, and then F0143, and then parentheses. This is referring to a material design icon. There's a tool in the palette to make it easier to find these. You don't have to memorize these codes. I just didn't want to go through the process of looking all that up. I may do a separate tutorial on that later. And then let's copy that from the off label and paste it into the on. So that gives us this little pointer thing. Let's set the font size to 16. And then on the widget page here, change the pop-up help to fade to 1. And I'm putting pop-up help in here because we also add buttons for jumping. We want it to be kind of clear which one is which. So just adding a little tooltip is helpful for that. Then let's get it to actually do stuff. So let's go over to one of our previews, copy that expression all the way up through eval in the parentheses, go back to our button, and then on the values page here, for the off to on script, keep it in constant mode, so don't switch it over to expression mode, just paste that in, and then do .par, and then capital F, fade to 1, pulse, and then parentheses. Now let's try clicking it, see what happens, and it does it. So great. Next, we want to make 2 more of those for jumping to the kind of middle state, and then also to the source 2. Let's give ourselves a little bit more room, and then make a copy of that button. Let's make another copy. So on the first copy, let's change this name to fade to mix button. And then for the script in the off to on parameter, change that 1 to mix. And then for the help and the pop-up help, change that because we don't want to have incorrect pop-up help because that'll just make things confusing. Then let's go to the third button, rename this to fade to 2 button, and then replace the 1 with the 2 in this off to on script and in the pop-up help. So that gives us these 3 buttons here, which are kind of working, but they're in kind of a weird location. So we're going to, instead of using kind of automatic left to right layout, we're going to use some expressions here. So on this fade button row, over on children mode, change that from left to right, the align to none. And then on the first button here, on layout page, let's change X to 0. And then on the second button, on layout, expand X, switch it over to expression mode, clear out what's currently there, and then we're going to put me dot panel, capital P parent, parentheses and close parentheses, dot width divided by 2 minus, and then me dot width divided by 2. So that's going to stick it right in the middle. And then on the third button, go over to layout, expand X, switch over to expression mode, clear out what's currently there. And for this one, we're going to do me.panel, capital P parent, then parentheses, close parentheses, dot width minus me dot width. That's going to stick it on the side there. So now we've got our buttons in the right place, and it's going to fade to whatever value we clicked there. Then you can also make a copy of this and include other ones for jump actions. I'm not going to cover that in this video just because it's going to make it really long, but if you want to, go for it. I will include that in the file download on Patreon though. Next, let's add a button to open the parameters of the crossfader so that you can get to that fade time and that composite mode. You could add separate widgets for those using like a drop-down or something, but the video is long enough, so we'll just do it the quick way. So open the palette, and let's drag in another button momentary. Close the palette. Make this a child of root panel. And then we're going to change this to settings button. On the layout page, for parent alignment, change it to ignore. And then for the width, let's do 30, and then height also 30. Then on the label page, let's switch off display. Button page, we're going to scroll all the way to the bottom, change horizontal mode to fill. And then scroll up. And on the layout page, expand the X parameter, go to expression mode, clear out what's currently there, and then do me.panel, capital P parent, parentheses, close parentheses, dot width minus me.width. So it's actually the same expression that we used for that fade to button on the side there. Then for Y, we're going to copy this expression, paste it in here, and then replace width with height, and do that for both of the places it appears in the expression. So that's going to stick it up in the corner here. And then on the button page, change this after 0x, delete that, and then do F0493. And then copy that and paste it in for the on label as well. That's going to give us this little gear icon. And then for the font size, we can bump that up to like 16 or so. Then for the scripts on the values page, we're going to go over to our one of our other buttons, copy out their script, go back over to the settings button, paste it in here, and then at the end, we're going to delete this pulse, and then we're going to delete the par. So everything after that eval in the parentheses, and then do dot open, and then capital P parameters, and then 2 parentheses. Let's try clicking that in the UI, and it's going to pop open this parameter dialog. So this is a good way to make it, feasible to just get a larger set of parameters from a UI without having to like build in widgets for every single part of it and kind of, crowd it up for stuff that you don't need as often. And that's it for what we're going to be building here. In the Patreon download, I'll add in a couple of extra features like an indicator that shows where that fade actually is, taking into account that smoothing, and then buttons for jumping. This implementation doesn't handle more than 2 sources, but if you have each of those sources be something where you can pick between multiple scenes, then that may be good enough for a VJ set. You could also try chaining multiple of these one after another if you wanted to mix, multiple layers of things, but that's going to be a little bit more complicated to manage. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully this is helpful. Let me know in the comments what you're using this Crossfader for, or what other types of components would help you in building out your performance rig. And I'm always looking for new topics to cover, especially things that aren't covered often. So leave a comment, let me know. If you want to support me making more of these videos, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get early access to tutorials and file downloads, including the one for this tutorial, and Discord access and other stuff like that. And make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. It really does make a difference to me to get comments. It kind of motivates me to keep doing this. So yeah, let me know if this is helpful for you.